Well, starting from the beginning, I've led two lives. One is a musician and a musician's attorney, representing songwriters around the world for 40 years. And that has been the way I've earned my living. My love for skiing has led me into a parallel semi-professional capacity as someone who's involved in all of the U.S. ski organizations. I'm vice chair of the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Hall of Fame and on the board of directors of the International Ski History Association, as well as on the board of advisors of Protect Our Winters. Great concern over the future, over the past of skiing, keeping the history alive, but also over the future of skiing and making sure that climate change does not interfere with the way the sport progresses and is maintained.
Oh, that is interesting. And your name, please?
Is Charlie Sanders.
Yeah. So all the topics you just mentioned are so interesting for us today. Even the climate change thing will be, so let's talk about that later.
Sure.
So we now would start with a story about Friedel Pfeiffer.
Yes, Friedel was one of the Hannes Schneider disciples, a world champion, of course, who emigrated from St. Anton, seeing what was happening in Europe and seeing the advantages of earning a very good living as a world-famous ski instructor and ski racer in the United States. So he was welcomed into the country in the early 1930s to mid-1930s and ended up in Sun Valley, where we're sitting right now, eventually becoming head of a ski school here. And suddenly, with the outbreak of the war, with the United States entry into it in December 1941, many of the Austrian instructors and others connected to Hannes Schneider's school in St. Anton. Hannes, of course, had arrived in 1938, I believe, in New England. Were faced with the choice of what they wanted to do. Very few opted to go back and become involved in the war on the side of the Axis. Friedel was one of those who volunteered to serve and, of course, was taken into the U.S. ski troops, the 10th Mountain Division, immediately as an instructor. And he was a sergeant, I believe. Went through all the training in Colorado at Camp Hale and eventually went overseas with the 10th Mountain. You would think that someone of his stature would have gotten special protection. All of the great athletes in the 10th Mountain Division, and there were many of them, insisted on being treated exactly as anyone else in the division was. And they were, and the proof of that is in the casualty rate that they suffered. Torger Tokl, the great Norwegian ski jumper, was one of those who joined up enthusiastically, went through all the training, trained other ski troopers, and was sadly killed in action. Several other people that we could mention suffered the same very sad fate. Friedel was grievously injured. I believe in March or April of 1945, towards the end of the war. He was hit with a shell fragment that broke most of his ribs and tore his lungs to shreds. And he happened to have been the benefit of knowing the field surgeon who was operating in that area, had skied with him at Sun Valley, and told him before they gave him morphine, "I know who you are and I'm going to save your life." And he did indeed, through incredible care that was given to most of the soldiers who were being treated. Enough so that he was able to survive. And not only survive, but he only had, I believe, half of his right lung was all that they could save on that side of his body. He was able to come home, and after a year of convalescence, was back to ski racing, which is very... that would be amazing in and of itself, but he also, of course, was part of the group that helped to turn Aspen into the world-famous ski area that it became and still remains. So he had a very, very important effect and made a great contribution to American skiing. And You know, and as a soldier, I think that we can't argue with the fact that he almost gave all for his adopted country, and we're all thankful and very proud of him.
That's a very nice story. And what I think he got a little bit more forgotten. He's he swapped to the background more, and others got more famous. Or
Yeah, you know, I think that in the circles in Aspen, he remained the gold standard, the platinum standard of the great European ski racer. Tony Matt, maybe a little bit more of a showman. Stein Eriksen, the great Norwegian Olympic athlete, who was too young to be in the war, but had come here. They were much more entertainers. And I think Friedel was interested in the business side. He was running a ski school. He was making sure that Aspen got off on the right foot. And for that reason, I think that his respect was preserved locally, but was not the kind of national exposure that someone like Stein Eriksen got.
who else is for you, or was a great skier who did something for the skiing industry?
As it relates to the 10th Mountain,
Yes.
there have been so many. Of course, Herbie Schneider comes to mind immediately. Wonderful, wonderful man. Always willing to give of his time. Very generous with telling stories and doing a fabulous job up at Cranmore in New Hampshire, and loved throughout the industry. It's very difficult to say anyone did more than he did. We mentioned Tony Matt. I think Luigi Forger and all of the St. Anton-based ski instructors who came here made a tremendous contribution. There were those, we talked a little bit about Hans Hauser, who was the first person selected to head the ski school here by Averell Harriman. He was a Salzburger and was a little bit more politically involved in the Nazification of the Alps than certainly any of the Western Austrian skiers were. And he eventually went to prison in the United States rather than joining the 10th. On the other hand, Otto Lang was very busy making films for the 10th Mountain and did all kinds of training productions. Hannes Schneider himself participated in those projects. And Hannes, because of the horror that he had seen in World War I, being stationed in the Dolomites, seeing what the Alpini and the Austrian mountain troops were forced to do to one another, I think it broke his heart, and it made him that much more sensitive to wanting to make sure that that never happened again. He made a great contribution to the growth of the sport in the United States, but I think also his role in giving very sound advice as to how to frame training, what happened 20 years before in World War I in the Alps, and how to avoid that. Those were very important contributions. And it's worth mentioning that out of those World War I avalanche duels that the artillery sections of those armies would fight came all of the avalanche control techniques that are still in use today. So it's a very interesting development. Just as ski music developed out of the military in Europe, avalanche control developed out of the military in Europe, and the esprit de corps, the good feeling of skiers together, no matter what nationality, getting together, playing on the mountain, skiing, singing, coming back and drinking. It led to the establishment of, I think, a very happy, thriving U.S. ski industry. And that all emanated from Europe.
Yesterday, when we had our film screening, someone asked us, why did Hannes stand up against the Nazis, and why did he not just say, okay, I do what you want? And I said, yeah, that's his character, and skiing brings people together. What do you think? Why did he stand up? First, because he saw it in World War I, and he didn't want to happen that again.
Yeah, I think that he was sensitized by what he had seen. I think that he was Catholic in the very broad sense of having been raised to respect life and everyone around him. He had many Jewish associates with whom he was good partners with and skied with. And I think that he saw a hate-driven ideology that was exactly the opposite of what he wanted the world to be like. I think that his work with Arnold Fanck and with Leni Riefenstahl informed his opinions about the use of mountain imagery in political ways. And clearly the Nazi regime was committed to using the mountains as propaganda. And I think he resented that. I think he resented what Leni Riefenstahl was doing. Having made all of those great films, from Pispaloo to Der Weiße Rausch, all of those films were about skiing as a way to bring people together. And she had suddenly become a proponent of using mountain imagery to tear people apart. And I think that bothered him a great deal. But most of all, I think he just could not bring himself to capitulate after the Anschluss with the Nazis. He was placed under house arrest. Why Miss Riefenstahl did not intervene, who knows? But it was worked out by his friends in the United States, on Wall Street and elsewhere, that this is somebody whose life is worth saving and bringing to the United States before the US's entry into the war, and who can really help us get this industry off the ground, teach people how to really ski well. And it was an opportunity as well as a political statement. So it worked out beautifully for everyone. And, Herbie came with him, and the first thing that he did after teaching was to join up with the 10th. So, they were appreciative of everything that had been done, and it worked out beautifully, and he remains revered, both of them do, in U.S. ski circles.
Did Herbie ever mention that it was hard for him maybe joining the 10th and then going to Europe and fight against France, or possibly?
I think anybody who left Europe, whether they were Hannes Schneider skiers, whether they were Norwegians who had been displaced from their own country, whether they were Jewish refugees who had been skiing all their lives and wanted to join up, there were any number of people who felt as though they were going back to their own country and fighting against the people they thought were their brothers and sisters. And I think that there was a great deal of heartache that was attached to that. But in the final analysis of, do we go do this or do we not, I think that the evils of fascism were enough to make them feel as though this was the right thing to do. And Herbie always loved to tell the story, whenever anyone asked, about towards the very end of the war. So yes, Hannes and Herbie always felt as though they were welcomed into the United States, and Herbie, of course, proved his allegiance immediately by joining up with the 10th Mountain, with all of the skiers like Tony Matt who were with him in New England. One of the stories that Herbie loved to tell, and we all enjoyed hearing it no matter how many times he told it, was he was certainly reluctant to go back home to fight against people that he considered his brothers and sisters. And it was a very difficult decision for all of those folks to go under those circumstances. But toward the end of the war, when it was apparent that the Allies were going to win, there was much more of an effort made to start interrogating captured prisoners. So anyone who spoke German fluently, especially Austrian dialect, since the 10th was fighting in the Dolomites, in the Südtirol, and the Alto Adige. Herbie was one of those who was taken and said by the 10th Mountain, saying, you speak the language, you know the local customs. My uncle as well. Will you serve as interpreters and help us, speaking to the prisoners? And Herbie ended up going from the Italian front up into Austria, back up through the Südtirol to St. Anton, and I guess Steuben, his hometown. And one fine day, I think in May of, either the end of April or the beginning of May of 1945, he walked into the kitchen of his own home in uniform. And of course, the members of his family present looked up and were startled that there was an American soldier in their home. And he basically took off his helmet and said, "It's me, Herbie." And the way he told the story was, after much rejoicing, sometime toward the middle of the night, they took him to bed and hoped that all of his schnapps would be gone by the morning. But he loved to tell that story. And I think one of the reasons why he loved it so much was that the amount of relief that he got of nobody's going to be mad at me that I fought on the Allied side. I came back home as a liberator, and everybody threw their arms around me and said, "We understand." I think it was one of the happier moments of his life. And he, as I said, never tired of reliving that moment, because I think it was very, very important to him. So, going back to the question of what was their reluctance, no matter how they felt politically about going back and fighting in Europe, yeah, I think everybody who came from Europe who wanted to go back and fight always had that little bit of, I wish we didn't have to do this. And I think Herbie was certainly one of those people, and thank goodness he had that experience. And it clearly, again, made a difference in his life to experience that homecoming.
Did he ever tell you about the Bronze Star he got?
Most of those guys were extremely reluctant to speak about their own commendations and medals. So I did not ever get from him the story of the Bronze Star, but he was in heavy, heavy combat, just the way all of those guys were. And Herbie, I believe, went through the entire campaign in Italy starting in late December. So they lost 1,000 men and killed, and probably another 4,000 to 5,000 wounded. So he was extraordinarily lucky to have come through, intact as he did. And again, they like to talk about the good times and never wanting to be recognized. The credo of most of those soldiers was, the only heroes are the ones who didn't come home. We are not heroes. We did our job. We're proud. Don't ask us to tell you about what we did. We did our bit, and that was that. So.
I think that was also maybe a reason why when they came back, they immediately started skiing again and build up ski schools, ski resorts.
Yep.
Maybe also to forget.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think that any of them ever lost their love for the mountains, but their appreciation for the mountains in peacetime, as opposed to the hell that they went through in the mountains during the war, made them really want to spend the rest of their lives building something that they could be proud of, that made people happy. And that they saw the devastation that had been done to the Alps, especially in the Südtirol, and that they wanted to rebuild what they loved, and they did.
It's very nice. Did you? When was the first time you met Herbie? How?
Growing up in New England, I always, because of my uncle having served, was introduced to these men who were just heroes, and larger than life. And everybody would go up to New Hampshire, and Herbie was just one of the guys. And somebody would explain that guy's father did, and it was always very interesting. But to most of us, he was just the happy guy that everybody called Herbie, and nobody really knew, as we were so young, who he was and what he had done. We didn't really have a very deep understanding of what all of these guys had been through. But gradually, as we got older, some of the stories would filter down to us. But the thing that most of all struck me about him and all of the people that he surrounded himself with was when we would be skiing, and people would, kids would complain, it's too cold, it's raining, those guys had the moral authority, because of who they were and what they had done, to say, you know what? I know it's raining, but if you really want to hear about a bad day in the mountains, I'll tell you about one. And suddenly everybody would just shut up and go skiing. So it was a good influence. They didn't have to tell any of his stories. It was just reminding us that it's a pretty lucky day to be in the mountains. Maybe complaining isn't the right approach, even if it is raining or cold. So that was part of his persona as well. It's like, we're here to have a good time, and I've had some not so good times. So I'm here to tell you, enjoy it while you have it. So it was as a youngster that I met him, but he was always around all of the get-togethers that I attended, and he was just an active, funny, gregarious guy.
And who was your uncle?
Yeah, this would be my next question. Yeah.
My uncle was named Norm Gavran. He was in the 86th Regiment, Company L, and he had been in the Army and wanted to transfer to the 10th Mountain because he had spent time in the mountains in Europe. And at the end of the war was the replacement, and was invited immediately to ski with the guys who knew that he had been a hiker and a skier before the war. And as a Jewish refugee, he was thrilled to be able to get back to the Alps. And he ended up going to the Grossglockner and skiing and mainly hiking for the rest of his life. But he lived to be 100 years old in the mountains in California. And he was a very proud member of the 10th, but also wanted to put it behind him, felt that he had seen terrible things, and wanted to concentrate on turning that into something good. So
I think for your uncle it must have been double as hard as for the others, When he comes, he flees, then he joins the 10th Mountain Division and goes back. What the others also did, they fought against maybe friends and family, but he not only friends, family, but also the bad thing. You know what I mean?
I do,
Yeah.
but also consider that many of those kids who were growing up there considered themselves, simply because they were one religion or another, considered themselves to be very enthusiastic members of the Austrian family, the German family. They all spoke German, as well as Yiddish, and many of them, I believe there were several members of the Hannes Schneider teaching crew who happened to have Jewish backgrounds. I believe the Klein brothers, I'm not sure, but there were a few. And it was the same. I think that, everybody was proud of their German, Central European culture and heritage. If it was Czech, if it was Polish in the area around Breslau, which was German then, all of those people had an affinity for Germany and German culture. So, it was very difficult with Nazism for those people, going back and fighting. but I would not eliminate altogether the fact that they also weren't very proud to be back. And in the same way that they went back and helped is the way that Herbie felt when he went back into his family. But a different situation for sure. A very interesting story about that, dealing with music while we're making that transition. It's very funny how Edelweiss, the song, has become synonymous with Austria. And frequently, in working in the music business all those years, I would get phone calls saying, well, we're using Edelweiss in a movie or we're using it on a TV show. We don't have to pay for that, right? Because it's the Austrian national anthem. And you would, of course, have to sit them down and explain to them that, no, Oscar Hammerstein and Richard Rodgers wrote this for The Sound of Music in 1958, two Jewish composers, and no, it's not in the public domain, and no, it's not the Austrian national anthem. But it did become, I think, the most evocative, emotive mountain song in history. So all of those cultures coming together for people who understood the mountains, expressing their love for it no matter what had happened and no matter what had taken place. The art and the sport brought everybody back together.
Comes up to my mind, do you know the series The Man in the High Castle? Have you heard of that, maybe?
The Man in the...
The Man in the High Castle. They are using Edelweiss as the title music.
Yeah, and I think that they also used the other very, very important song from Cabaret, which is Tomorrow Belongs to Me, which Kander and Ebb took from a folk song that they had heard growing up from Austria or maybe Bavaria. And that was also used, I believe, in The Man in the High Tower. So all of this blends together. It was one culture torn apart by some very bad folks. And it's the history of the 20th century of war and strife. And unfortunately, we're seeing it again. But hopefully, intelligent, good-feeling people will come back together and make sure that we do not go down that road.
Hope so too. The 90 pounds of rucksack, or do you know them?
Sure. 90 Pounds of Rucksack was a conglomeration. It's based upon a hit song called Bell Bottom Trousers, which was a hit, a big band hit in the late 1930s, early 1940s. There were several guys in the 10th Mountain Division who became expert at doing parody lyrics. So they would take the song and make up new lyrics, having fun. One of them was a guy named Ralph Brommigan, who grew up in Seattle, Washington. His parents and grandparents came from Norway. And he was one of those who worked on the lyrics to many of the 10th Mountain songs, including 90 Pounds of Rucksack, which talked about various misadventures of 10th Mountain soldiers and with local barmaids, etc., and carrying the heavy packs that they did. Ralph Brommigan also tragically died in the war. He was a captain and was killed early on in the fighting in Italy. Like Torger Tokl, it's unclear if he was killed by friendly fire or not, which was a terrible problem fighting in the mountains because sight lines were so badly convoluted that it was so easy to mistake your comrades for the enemy. So both sides had huge amounts of difficulties with that. But yeah, he will forever be remembered as being one of those who contributed the lyrics to all of the 10th Mountain songs, including 90 Pounds of Rucksack.
What are the other 10th Mountain songs about?
A lot of them were Norwegian-based because there were so many Norwegians who had been abroad when Norway was attacked in 1940 and who were basically stranded outside the country. and wanted to join up. So they formed the 99th Infantry Division, which trained with the 10th Mountain Division. So you had all of these Norwegians. And the 10th Mountain guys from the United States loved the accent. So they all wrote songs about Ole and Sven, etc., getting into fights over which was more important, ski jumping or Alberg technique, how they all hated snowshoes, and a lot of really funny stuff about how hard the training was, and that combat couldn't possibly be this bad as their training was. Their training was rough, but unfortunately combat was much worse. But every once in a while, those guys would say, in the middle of a battle, somebody would say, wow, if this gets any worse, it'll be as bad as training at Camp Hell, to try to make light of the situation. So they were very well trained and extremely tough guys.
Or shall we first continue with your uncle in the 10th?
There's really not much to tell. He got a Bronze Star too, and he, just came home and wanted to go hiking.
Yeah.
So
then tell us first about, because we were at the music, tell us about your favorite ski song.
Oof. Boy, that's a hard one. Yeah, I don't want you to waste it. I got to think about this. I mean, the easiest answer, of course, is Edelweiss. I think that it is so pervasive and such a beautiful melody and song, and the lyrics are so wonderful that it's hard to think of another song that conveys that kind of feeling of sitting around the fire, the Gemütlichkeit, all of that is encapsulated in that one song, and it's a beautiful work of art, and I think generations of people have appreciated that. So I would have to say it's Edelweiss.
Have you ever met the Trupps?
Yes. Very interesting, nice family, and the hotel in Stowe is magnificent, and they have a several generation tradition of making people happy through their singing. So I think two of the Von Trapps, of course, were in the 10th Mountain Division, two of the brothers, and their story was very important. I think Sound of Music is a very important movie from a historical perspective, and it was a beautiful Broadway show as well. So I think that they made the most out of a terrible situation of having to flee the country that they loved, and making a new home for themselves. And we're all very proud New Englanders to have the Von Trapps as part of our larger family.
So then let's go to the Alpenverein.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The earliest days of the Nazi Party in Munich were difficult for everyone, because after the war there was street fighting going on, people being killed and assassinated all over the place. Somehow along the line, I believe that there was an Austrian politician based in Vienna named von Schonerer. And Hitler was a disciple of his, as were several of the members of the Bavarian Alpenverein. And for whatever reason, that drew them together. Now, when the beer hall putsch failed in 1924, or 23 or 24, and Hitler was sent to prison, the Alpenverein rallied around him. And I think, first patterns of wanting to use the Alps in the post-World War I era, and especially after the loss of the Südtirol to Italy, to use that as an organizing tool, that these are our Alps. The Bavarian Alps, the Tyrolean Alps belong to us and no one else, and we're going to take them back, became a very important element in Nazi mythology. And it was, as we know, the connection to the runes and the Nordic traditions of Wagner and others, always put together into a very strange amalgamation of I guess, propaganda that was built upon by the Nazis and eventually by Goebbels to create this myth of Alpine superiority that certainly did not really exist in history. Most of the mountain climbing had been done by the French, the British, and the Swiss. And it's very interesting how the Alpenverein was used eventually as a tool, not only to recruit people into the SA and the Nazi movement, but also to serve as a training ground for paramilitary groups, because the Treaty of Versailles precluded the German government from doing that. Yeah, the very interesting story about how after World War I, the Alpenverein, which of course had been extremely active in fighting on the Südtyrolean Alto Adige front, came home and were disenfranchised, had no jobs, and many of them felt as though they wanted to get politically involved. And the leaders of those groups were, for the most part, followers of a politician in Vienna named von Schörner. Adolf Hitler, who came from that area, also a disciple of von Schörner, and they found themselves in Munich. And the very first more ardent members, other than the inner circle of the Nazi Party that was founded in the early 1920s in Bavaria, were members of the Alpenverein. And it was clear from what happened in the Beerhol Putsch and the failed attempt to take over the Bavarian government in 1923 and 1924, and Hitler being sent to prison, that some of his most important followers were very much attached to the Alpenverein, wanted to see the Aryanation of the Alps, having lost what they considered to be the most beautiful part of the Alps, the Südtirol, to the Italians and the Allies. There was, of course, a lot of anger and frustration. And this grew into, I think, the Alpenverein becoming a subgroup of the Nazi Party, which served as a cover for the Nazis to not have to violate the Treaty of Versailles by having the government train its people, but to have a private organization become a paramilitary arm of the Nazi Party. And the Alpenverein has only recently begun to look into its own archives about this, especially from the 1920s and the 1930s, to recognize that it gradually put the race clauses into its membership documents, gradually began to exclude anyone who was non-Aryan, and eventually literally served as the training ground for the initial Nazi, I won't say shock troops, but I will say street fighters and then mountaineers, who again began to use the mountain mythology that was so important to the Nazi leaders in building up a history that never before existed, which was that the Eastern Alps had been Germanized always and should be Aryanized once again. And this became a building block of, and you could see it in Mein Kampf, when Hitler wrote it, that mythology was going to play a very important role in how the Nazi Party grew and attempted to create a fiction of tradition that did not exist, that would bring a country that had not been cohesively formed until the 1870s to feel as though they had a common past. And the results, of course, were global tragedy. So I think that the Alpenverein could help historians a great deal by showing how that came to pass, by talking about some of those connections, and how do we avoid ever having something like that happen again?
That's amazing. And just another question because you mentioned that, then I think then we are, yeah, it's okay, then we'll release you. You said in the beginning something about the Americans who brought Hannes Schneider over with the bank, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Do you know something about this?
Yeah. Yes. In terms of Hannes Schneider being under house arrest, he had many friends in the United States. Many of the wealthy Wall Street investors and law firms were regularly going to Europe to ski and to enjoy their holidays there, and were raising money for the Third Reich, having no political implications other than it was a good investment because it seemed as though fascism was leading a revival out of the Depression. So many of the Wall Street firms were deeply involved in finance as in terms of rebuilding the Ruhr Valley, rebuilding the armaments industries, the auto industries, etc. And Harvey Dow Gibson was one of those investment bankers who had a friendship with Hannes Schneider, who also owned hotels up in New England, and who was a musician in addition to that, and had always dreamed of a Tyrolean, Bavarian type alpine resort that he could invite Americans to. And I think that in addition to his friendship and his admiration for Schneider, he saw a business opportunity and an opportunity for fun to bring the greatest skier in the world over to become his partner in a venture that was very close to his heart. So Harvey Gibson, I think, was able to dial the right numbers to say, I will take this guy off your hands to whoever the powers that be were in the Reich or in Austria after the Anschluss, by explaining to them, you don't really want the world thinking that you're mistreating Hannes Schneider. Just send him to us, and he'll go skiing. And I think that was a very clever way of avoiding what could have been a tragedy. And it worked. And I know that Hannes's wife was sick at the time. It was important that she get out of the country. And, it's a wonderful story that had benefits to the family and to American skiing beyond what we can really measure.
That's true. And one last question. Just if you maybe know, I'm not sure because lawyer and Dr. Rosen, where Hannes war in Garmisch in house arrest, and he protected Hannes there. I'm not sure. Maybe you heard about something about it because we heard that he might have been a lawyer also when Hitler was imprisoned, and then there was the trial. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, the trial of Hitler in 1924 was a show trial. He had committed treason, obviously, and he was given, 14 months in prison. Yeah, Rosen, I don't know. I'll have to look that up because I think there was a lot going on there. And, there was so much. Western Austria was so isolated that all of the action was taking place really in Vienna. And there were some bad people involved in the Anschluss. And Western Austria, I think, was pretty much a haven away from that, which was why it was so shocking to see, a place like St. Anton or Steuben affected by all of this. But yeah, I will check on that for you.
Yeah, that would be amazing because maybe you have some, you can, as a lawyer, you find something, or that would be interesting.
It's a fascinating story. I will also say to you on camera that there are some incredible stories about people who skied to freedom out of the Alps. Jimmy Peterson's uncle skied through, I think, the area southwest of Ischgl into the Graubünden. There were many skiers, Jewish skiers in Breslau who were able to take the rail lines down to the Risingerberger Mountains, which I think is northern Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, and were able to cross through mining operations. They would ski down during the night, wearing sheets in the same way that the mountain troops would wear sheets so that they couldn't be spotted on the trails. And there are fascinating stories of people being saved, Jews and non-Jews, by being skied out of the Reich. There was also a movie shot right here in Sun Valley in 1940 called The Mortal Storm, which starred Jimmy Stewart and was about ski rescues from Bavaria out of the Reich. Now, of course, to escape from Bavaria, you'd have to take someone into the Tyrol. But be that as it may, it was very interesting that it took place here. And that's another story for another day. But fascinating. Everybody is still fascinated, I think, with these World War II stories. And the adventure and tragedy and bravery all rolled into one make for some incredible stories. So.